Is that weird Korean novel that Brandon Sanderson wrote while he was on vacation 10 years back any good? That's what we're here to find out. Welcome to Intermerifica, New Mexico, the channel where we look at things of wonder from the perspectives of faith and reason, philosophy and theology. I'm your host, Daniel Kelly. And one of my favorite wonders that we find ourselves amidst is literature and fiction. And today we're going to be looking at Brandon Sanderson's book, The Emperor's Soul. There will be slight spoilers, like in all my book reviews, not really heavy ones, but if there's a 10-year-old book that you don't want slight spoilers on, I recommend you just go read it. The Emperor's Soul, I really liked reading because it was interesting to see all these Far Eastern themes handled by Brandon Sanderson. And I like Brandon Sanderson as an author because he reminds me of David Eddings, where he writes as a job. Right? He's not just, when the magical inspiration hits me, I'm going to go write. That's not how the psalmist did it. The psalmist wrote to order, a lot of them. And a writer should write like any other job. I don't just go to work when I feel the inspiration to do it. No. If I'm a writer, I'm going to write. And Brandon Sanderson had the skills to do it, and he writes like a job, and I think that's really cool. I also think it's really cool, this Far Eastern setting and the different philosophical things that it brings up. So the first thing I have to say is reading this book really reminded me of reading Cardinal Pell's prison journals. I think really the main thing of the story is, was it like just to be in prison for a while? You're just in solitary confinement. It's a good thing this book is pretty short, because just like with Cardinal Pell's prison journals, they're hard to get through because it's like not a lot happens when you're in solitary confinement. And when he's just journaling, it's very inspiring, and I recommend you to go read it. But it's like a spiritual exercise to read it. And it must have been even worse for him. But for this book, I'm glad it's short, because it wouldn't be a spiritual exercise to read it, but it has that same feeling of being in solitary confinement. And I really think that's the main theme of this story, which I think is really cool. It's a really cool thing to experience through reading it, and to it's not something that's really written very much, and I think that Brandon Sanderson captures it is a real testament to his ability to write. Another thing that's really interesting is Brandon Sanderson brings in this idea where everything has a soul in this world, and that's really cool. This is tied to he's kind of become famous for each of his worlds has a signature magic system, and this has to do with this signature magic system is that, everything has a soul, which some of us might think, that's weird, that's Eastern, that's not Christian, but that's closer to St. Thomas's thought than you might actually think, because every thing that exists does have a spiritual reality in the mind of God, and in that sense is a living reality. Every created thing has a spiritual living dimension, because everything is alive in God. Even these things like a dead rock is alive in God. I'll put a citation to one of Joseph Piper's books that talks about this really well, but everything is alive in the mind of God, and everything that exists reflects the mind of God in some way. Venerable Fulton Sheen, or Blessed Fulton Sheen, put it really well, this description that is a Thomistic idea, and even older than that, it's a Platonic idea, but refined in Christianity. Fulton Sheen says, and it's really, really powerful, in his book, The World's First Love, so I'll just read that real quick. God, too, has within himself blueprints of everything in the universe. As the architect has in his mind a plan of the house before the house is built, so God has in his mind an archetypal idea of every flower, bird, tree, springtime, and melody. There never was a brush touched to canvas, nor a chisel to marble, without some great pre-existing idea. So, too, every atom and every rose is a realization and concretation of an idea existing in the mind of God from all eternity. All creatures below man correspond to the pattern God has in his mind. A tree is truly a tree because it corresponds to God's idea of a tree. A rose is a rose because it is God's idea of a rose wrapped up in chemicals and tints and life. And we add to this Joseph Piper's insight that all these ideas in the mind of God, right? He's a great Thomist, are alive. Everything that is in God has life. So it really is true that, like the Studio Ghibli movie and the Eastern conception of things, is sometimes closer to reality than our modern rationalistic, materialistic view of things, right? So, like the Studio Ghibli Spirited Away, I think that is a great representation of how things really are, the spiritual dimensions. Okay, so that's cool. And this book, The Emperor's Soul, kind of plays with that a little bit. So, but if that's the reality, if that's true, then what does that mean? What does that mean for a world? What does that mean for a story? And I think this is where Brandon Sanderson could have been helped out from some Eastern philosophy better. I always think Brandon Sanderson, usually when I have difficulty with his writings, it usually is on the philosophical domain. His philosophical presuppositions, I think, hurt his narratives at different points. And I think he shows himself to be very Western when, okay, if everything has a soul, what do we do with it? Well, we screw with it. What can we do with it? What can we force? And what can we have this utility for us? How can we mess with it, right? And I think that's a very Western idea. And I'm not blaming Brandon Sanderson for this at all. This is something that our Western society just presupposes, right? This kind of idea that comes from Galileo, where if nature won't give us its secrets, we're going to torture it out of her, right? We just want to mess around with nature. That's what we see our role as stewards is just how can I squeeze as much out of nature as I can? And it comes from Galileo, and Pope Benedict talks about that really well in his series of lectures collected in the beginning. So there's that Western mindset. So if there's a spiritual reality, well, I'm going to mess around with it. And I think that could have been more richly brought out these ideas in the narrative if we went to like some Eastern sages, right? Some Eastern philosophers, since this book is a Eastern book, right? It's supposed to be based off Korean mythology. So, right, there's the story of the guy who, in Eastern philosophy, there's this guy who he sees this very wise man who's completely in tune the way he should be, but he takes forever bringing water to his garden. And the noble says, hey, look, I have this contraption that's really cool that could help you bring the water to your garden so you wouldn't have to work as much. And the guy's like, no, I don't have anything to do with those contraptions. And then the people go to Confucius, and this is a story, this I don't think actually happened in Confucius's life. Confucius is very smart, and we could get into this, but they go to Confucius in the story and say, hey, who's right? Like, should we just be all away from technology like the guy? And he's like, no. Just the way he had his inner life ordered, we should order everything outside of us. That's the way of the truly wise man, right? So I think there's this really cool tension in Eastern philosophy that they're always looking at is we are always in the West, we're always trying to see how can I extend my control over more stuff? How can I, it's very outward. And in the East, it's very inward. And how do we put these two together so that we're not like the man who had his inward all in order, but didn't have the outward world reflecting that, right? So how can we balance our technological need and our inner need and not let one dominate over the other? And I think how we do this is we've already got that Western part. We need to bring in some of this Eastern part. Like Pope Francis said on his visit to Japan, I thought it was really powerful. There is this Eastern wisdom, this is quoting from Pope Francis, which is not just the wisdom of knowledge, it is the wisdom of time, the wisdom of contemplation. It is very helpful for Western society, always too rushed, to learn some contemplation, to stop, to look at things, even poetically. Do you know what? Thinking about this is my personal opinion. I think that the West lacks a bit of poetry. There are many beautiful poetic things, but the East goes beyond. The East is capable of looking at things with eyes that see beyond. It was when Pope Francis was coming back from Japan, but I think it applies to a lot of Far Eastern places. But I think we're missing that part, and I think that's a little bit what's missing from Brandon Sanderson's. He brings in this Korean mindset and worldview, but in a very Western way, where it's just, what can I do with stuff? This very rushed Western mindset that Pope Francis. So I think we need to unite East and West. I think that would have helped the narrative in The Emperor's Soul to have that attitude towards the spiritual world that the book describes, that physical things have this spiritual reality. So I think this Eastern philosophy would have helped bring that in. And that brings us to the other main part of this book that I think is really important. And that's the idea, one of the main things the main character is trying to do, and this gets a little bit more spoiler if you want to go read it, if the parts I've said so far make you want to go read it. But the main thing is this guy basically has brain damage, and she's trying to fix his soul, the ruler, so he can go on ruling. But is it fixing, or is it putting her own ideas in? Because she can put her own, I want him to be doing this different or this different. And I think that would have also been really, really helped by some more of Eastern philosophy, if they had actually brought in this Far Eastern philosophy into the story instead of just having this surface level Western philosophy in there. Because if she's just helping him, we can help people who have brain damage. But if we are forcing him to believe the truth, that's not okay at all. Because, and I think this theme of force is something that we see a lot in Brandon Sanderson's work, and it's not a bad thing on him. It's our philosophy in the West right now. We don't think that truth can justify itself, so we have to add force, right? So because we have relativism, these competing truth claims, and we're like, well, that's your truth and this is my truth. Well, if that's true, as Pope Francis said in Fratelli Tutti, then the only way that we're going to solve these is by violence, right? If we don't just cling to that there is the truth that we can find out, well, then violence is the way to solve these competing truth claims. And I think that's one of the things that bothers me a lot in Brandon Sanderson's work is that his philosophy, as he says in Tress of the Emerald Sea, right? It's okay to have these lies and stuff to help out truth about history or whatever, because as long as you're getting to the bigger truth, but no, truth, if you really believe in truth, doesn't need any force. Lying to help truth is a kind of force. Using violence to help truth, that's a kind of force. And our world today tries to use more and more force to back up its truth claims. And I think that's very bad. That's one of the things I don't like about Brandon Sanderson's is there's a lot of unnecessary violence in his, even on the part of the good guys in his stories. Not so much in this one. That's one of the things I liked about this one, but in his works overall. But truth, we know the only way that truth has to establish itself by its own native beauty. As Pope Paul VI said in Dignitatis Humanae, the truth cannot impose itself except by virtue of its own truth, as it makes its entrance into the mind at once quietly and with power. That's the way truth is, and if we don't believe that, then we're going to have different ways to try to force people, manipulating them or using violence or whichever way. And that's what she's doing in this story, which isn't really clear, is to force him to see the truth, then it's no good. If it's helping him, more like a doctor, then it's okay. And the story doesn't really answer this question because it's very light on the philosophy, like a lot of Brandon Sanderson's books. I like that he says, I remember reading in his introduction to one of the Mistborn books where he says that he thinks philosophy is super important, and I do too. I just think his philosophy is very surface level and poor sometimes with his book. But in this idea for the Emperor, when we're the Emperor's new soul, we're building his new soul, basically, I think some of the ideas from Eastern philosophy really could have helped this book. And I want to quote something from that really inspired me from Mencius. He's one of the Eastern philosophers that we're not very familiar with, usually in the West, where he's describing the human person, the human soul, and I think some of these ideas of the human soul and the human person really could have helped this story. He's talking about the vital part of the human spirit, and we could get into all this, but basically the human spirit. It is a spirit extremely great and extremely strong. When nourished by rectitude and kept integral, fills up all between heaven and earth. It is a spirit that must be mated to justice and the natural law. Without these it would be starved. In fact, it is born of an accumulation of justice, not something which justice invades from outside and takes to itself. Its very life depends upon justice. For whenever your conduct does not satisfy your conscience, the vital spirit suffers starvation. I think this was really good because it's two things. So to shed light on this story. So is she basically feeding the spirit with justice? His spirit had been kind of starved. Is she helping to feed it so grow to get it back healthy again? Well, then it's good. But justice never invades the human spirit from the outside, right? As Mencius just taught us. It's something that's a part of the human spirit, right? And I think a lot more of Mencius's philosophy could have helped this story be much stronger. What is it that makes a human person really strong? And we see in the story, he talks about there's like these different basically pillars of the human soul, which that would be really cool. It doesn't really get more into it. But Mencius does talk about what are the different pillars of the human soul. So I think the story would have been way richer if we could have looked at something like Mencius's insipid parts of the human nature, right? Because they're already saying, yeah, there's these parts that are integral to the human nature that she's building off of. But what are those? Doesn't really get into that. And that leads into that Mencius said you had to grow these, right? You had to grow these. It leads into what I think is the difficulty between East and West, and this story highlights that very well. Here's one of Mencius's stories that I think is really good. Let's not be like the man of Sung. Once upon a time there was a farmer in the state of Sung, who, being grieved that his corn did not grow faster, went to pull it up that it might look taller. And this is talking about the building up of the spirit, which is kind of the theme of the story. He then returned home with a look of stupid complacency, and said to his folks, "Oh, I'm really tired out today. I've been helping the corn to grow by leaps and bounds." His son ran out to look at it, and lo and behold, the corn was all withered. There are few people in the world who are not dealing with their own nature as this man did with his corn, forcing it mechanically to grow taller in stature. Some consider all labor a futility and therefore abandon all effort. They are those who do not even weed their corn. The hasty improvers, on the other hand, are those who uproot it. They not only waste their labor, but do great harm. So there's both things. We don't want to be kind of like quietists. We're not going to uproot the weeds in our nature. But on the other hand, we don't want to be like the improver who's just trying to force it to grow. And I feel like this story, it doesn't really struggle with these themes enough. But what she's doing to the Emperor's soul borders too much on this Western way of just trying to force everything. Force it. And that actually would, in reality, do great harm. So in the end, I really liked this story. I'm glad it was short, especially because there's some themes that aren't really developed, but I would have really liked if more of Eastern philosophy could have been brought in, or even Western philosophy. I think that would have made this story much, much more powerful. So it's an enjoyable read. I hope you'll go check it out, and if it interests you, if you're like, wow, this is kind of cool, I encourage you to go look at more, look at what Confucius taught, look at what Mencius taught, and maybe even you could look at what St. Thomas Aquinas taught. I hope that was helpful to you. You have a wonderful day. God bless you.